Welcome back to another episode of Just a
A
Squirrel
squirrel
looking for a
for a
nut,
nut,
trying
trying
to
to
get
get
out of
out of
this
this
rut.
rut. Oh my God! We did it! I hope someone is listening to this without telling us, because this is the first time we've ever done it. Now, I know people have eavesdropped on us and they've been talking about us behind our back whenever we try and do one of these things, but this time we got it right. They cannot criticize us. They can't gossip about us or anything. Oleg, it is good to see you. Let's talk a little bit about eavesdropping.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget one time I got a bold new haircut when I was in college. I had a line that was going back here, and then I had it super short, and then I had sort of a long mohawk thing going on. I think I might have even put some punk rock color in there because I wanted to look like a rebel. And I went into the cafeteria and was chowing down on some food. And then as I walked to the food station, two women who were at the food station with their backs to me, they were getting their salad. I was walking past that station. I heard one of them say, her name was Miriam. She said, "And Michelle, have you seen Scott Mason's hair?" And I stopped and I listened. And then the other one said yes. And then fortunately, Miriam, the first one, said, "That was some dope blank." So I was eavesdropping on some conversation about myself, but it was good.
Mm-hmm.
Another time, I got on the phone with a friend of mine who was chatting with someone I'll call Patty. And he was talking away with Patty, and they basically, or no, maybe he was talking to me. And yes, he was talking to me. And he said, "What do you think of Patty?" And I said my honest opinion about Patty. I didn't like her.
Mm-hmm.
I think she had said some racist stuff that I didn't like. I was not down with. And then after I was done saying my piece, who should have been on the other line eavesdropping but Patty? She and I never spoke to each other again. Has anything like that ever happened to you?
I think to a degree, I've had situations like that where I've eavesdropped on certain people's conversations. I wouldn't say it was always about me, but I think there was always a genuine curiosity to want to know what other people are saying and how they think. I know that a friend of mine does this quite often. Every time her and I would go to a restaurant, she would much rather be in the other conversation than the conversation that's taking place in front of her. Which to me, I find
what
it
other conversation? The one on the table
right.
next door?
Yeah, which to me, I find amusing because it's fascinating how I think interesting other people are in their lives and experiences, and considering the fact that we can only walk in our own shoes, it's probably harder to understand, and that's where I think the increased curiosity comes from. Wanting to understand what are the other people going through and what has their experience been like. And the other thing that I think I've also been somewhat interested in, not necessarily anything to pursue because I don't really know how to do that, but what is it that people say about you when you are not in the room? I think that's probably been one of...
Why don't we start there?
Yeah. But that's been one of the topics that I've been that's been one of the topics that I've genuinely, I think, been curious about. And I don't know, how do you find an answer to that question besides maybe asking the people who were in the room of whether or not you were a topic of discussion? Because you have to be, to a degree,
Yeah.
Just like other people are a topic of discussion for who you are and who you choose to have a conversation with.
We're social beings, and to the extent that as social beings we are always interacting with each other, then even if we're not deliberately just sitting down and talking about other people because we have nothing better to do with our lives, we're going to end up always talking about other people because of our interactions with them. For instance, you may ask me, "Oh, have you ever worked with so-and-so, so-and-so?" reached out to me and wanted to do a special event with me or wanted to collaborate with me. And hopefully my response will be something like, oh my God, they were amazing. You'll have the time of your life. And even if
Exactly.
that's what I'm saying, we're still talking about another person.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it happens probably a lot more often than one could assume.
Yeah.
And I also think that something that you just mentioned, as far as us being social beings and wanting to literally be part of different groups and amongst a group of other beings, it's almost inevitable to avoid
Yeah.
in having a conversation about someone else, whether it's dead or alive or present or not. So I think I don't know. It's interesting to explore, why do we do it to begin with,
Yeah.
and then from there, what does that say about who you are as an
Absolutely.
individual when you choose to tell it? Is that, I mean, I guess another way to look at it is, would you say that the act of listening, I understand, but then the act of sharing that information, is that a form of gossip?
And when does conversation about another person that has true business or other functional utility change into something that is purely gossip? Now, I just want to say this quickly. I cannot see the comments because I am calling, or I'm participating in this call via my phone from a hotel room in Philadelphia. So my phone has limited StreamYard capability. StreamYard, for those of you who don't know what that is a streaming service. I see that we have a guest who has said, good question. Louisa, I believe. The names are so small on my phone, I can barely read it. Good. I'm glad my eyesight is good. In any event, make sure you say whatever you want to say about times you've eavesdropped, stories you have about what you've heard when you've eavesdropped, especially if it's about you, and anything else that you want to comment about concerning the topics that we talk about tonight. You know, Oleg, when I was younger,
Mm-hmm.
either during times in which I felt socially precarious or in times in which I was disengaged before I really found my mission in life, I found it easier to, or was more commonly finding in my circle, people that spent a lot of time talking about others.
Mm-hmm.
And some people, particularly in workplaces that I was in, would spend all of their time talking about others. Now, in each of those cases, I will say the workplaces that I was in were highly toxic, highly politicized, or weird stuff was generally going on. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in a way, I viewed the talking about what was going on, although it wasn't directly related to business, a lot of it was personal, although some of it was related to business, but it was related to behaviors in the business that were unethical, like people sleeping with their boss.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, superficially, it could be seen as gossip, and perhaps it technically was gossip. Many times it was certainly juicy enough to be right up there with the best gossip I've heard anyway. But other times, as I thought about it, there was something going on beneath the surface. For instance, real information that was underneath the top level current of the business operation that I needed to know in order to function in that business effectively was being passed on through the gossip network.
Mm-hmm.
Or information about the um, dysfunctional or nature of some of the interrelationships in the office, or character issues that I needed to know about, or explanations for things that I didn't understand were going on, what were going on. I had, for instance, someone that I worked with, a colleague, who behaved very erratically during meetings. Very, very erratically. And there were weird things that were happening with her that I didn't understand. For instance, she would bring out these big, gigantic pipes as she would bust out of the meeting and run to the bathroom. I didn't understand what on earth was going on. Why did she? And it was, New York City has been non-smoking since the 90s. What the hell is this about? Well, gossip, or at least things that she might have considered, inappropriately newsworthy had she been eavesdropping, actually helped fill in gaps of information that I had and helped me manage my expectations for what her capabilities were in the job. I'll just put it that way. What are your thoughts hearing that?
I think it's interesting that you shared that, because you and I have had multiple conversations where I would say something before, or before I choose to share, I'll say, hey, everything I'm about to share with you, I don't want it to impact, your opinions of what you think of the other individual, or the relationship that you have with them. So that's where I think the eavesdropping and then the gossip, I don't know if it necessarily crosses the line and becomes something more than it has to be. But I do think that to a degree, there is an interesting thing that happens, and that's how much do you choose to take someone else's opinion and perspective and make it your own.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, in the case of someone speaking behind you in a room when you're not present, and then that opinion gets passed on to whoever down the road, and then that becomes the ultimate truth about that person or that experience. So whether it's them being, like you mentioned, the coworker or whatever it is, how do you choose to differentiate that? How do you choose to look at that? Okay, that's just one opinion. That's just someone else's perspective, compared to, okay, that is my truth. That's the truth I choose to accept. Which I think that leads to another question within all of that, and that's choosing to care about what other people think about you.
Yes.
And I don't know where that comes from. I think that probably comes from a form of validation. I don't know if that's something that all of us seek or desire, or if it's something that is almost like inevitable at this point. Is it actually possible to operate in a world where you're not seeking some form of validation from someone else other than yourself?
One job I worked at was, I think most would argue, highly dysfunctional
Mm-hmm.
in its internal politics at the executive level. And one level of that dysfunction was a constant series of arguments that I was having with a member of that organization's executive team, who, by the way, seemed to have a lot of arguments with a lot of people. So it wasn't just me. But that being said, I felt I had to tread very lightly
Mm-hmm.
because this person had come with my boss from his prior job into her current position. Not only that, she said that she was unofficially, on my first day, I'm unofficially his second in command. And they also left work together every day and rode a train home together every day. And there were rumors that were never validated that there was even more to their relationship. But one of the things that she would threaten me with is, if you disagree with me or if you don't do what I want, I will talk to the boss of this, my boss on the way home.
Mm-hmm.
There's a reason why he travels home with me every night, and he listens to what I say. And by the way, he doesn't travel home with you every night.
Mm-hmm.
So there was, at one point, the conflicts were such that it was unbearable for me. I was seriously considering getting another job. And I talked to someone whose judgment I trust about this very candidly. And I said, I just, you know, this person views me as very stupid. She is constantly openly stating that and passive aggressively stating it and all of that sort of stuff. And I said, it makes me feel very like I'm on edge all the time. My performance isn't as good. Not only that, but if she thinks I'm stupid, I believe my boss will think I'm stupid, and because they talk and all this sort of stuff. And he said, well, why do you even care what she thinks? Why are you giving her opinion so much credence? And I said to him the truth, which is, she has a lot of, or at least she's claiming to have a lot of influence on my boss. And I have heard, I don't know if it's true, it has not been substantiated, but I have heard she may have a I'll just put it that way, of influence over him. And so I had to care, I felt, because if she had that sort of influence, then these conflicts we were having, I felt, put my job at risk. Now, if that were me now, which is almost 10 years later, I would be just like, fine, fire me if you want to, or think whatever you will. I would have, whatever. Did not have the level of self-confidence that I have right now. Then I felt very much my job could evaporate on the spot and I wasn't ready. And so I did care. Do you feel like that care was legitimate, or do you really think it was my issue for not having the confidence to not care, even if the worst case scenario about their relationship were true?
I think it's probably a combination of both. I think it's probably a combination of not having the confidence maybe to, move into your role and really embrace who you are.
Yeah.
But then also I think it's a legitimate thing to understand that the other individual does influence or can influence the decision making or the decision making process of the one who's above. So I think it's a legitimate thing to be able to look at both of those situations and look at it. I get curious as far as one of the things that I've heard within the past however many years by now is that as one becomes older, they tend to care less about the opinions from others, but I never fully understood why. Why does that happen? Is it because the time is limited to care about what everyone else is thinking, or is it because people have found their own path? Therefore, other people's opinions and perspectives of what someone else should be doing doesn't truly matter as much anymore compared to when we were younger and we were seeking guidance from probably every single person surrounding us, right? Or at least close to it.
Yes.
So that's where everyone's opinion did matter. And everyone's opinion is something that maybe we valued a lot more than we were older.
Maybe. I wonder how universal that is. Look, when I was your age, and you're a day or two younger than me, that's right. I was very concerned about what other people thought because, again, I felt my job was dependent on it. I also felt that in the organizations that I worked in, as I mentioned earlier in this show, there was a lot of politicization. And by politicization, I mean, it wasn't decisions, promotions, opportunities, project assignments, that sort of thing, were determined not necessarily by merit, at least in my perception, but by the political nature, by the affiliations that people had with each other, or other reasons that were not necessarily legitimate, at least they weren't necessarily related to merit. And so I felt in those situations extremely insecure. If I fell out of favor, I was at risk of a career derailment. Now, going to your theme of maturation and its relationship to that, I do believe that the importance of those sorts of things, or my ability to respond to or be favorably to benefit from those sorts of situations, was heavily influenced by my familial situation, where there was favoritism. And that's just that. And so I grew up used to it and almost expecting it in situations that replicated my family. And so as I matured in life and moved further and further away from that milieu that I grew up in, I was able to distinguish between the two. And that really was just age, experience, meeting more people outside of my family environment, understanding that not everyone, learning from other people, that not everyone thought the same way, or that every dynamic in the whole world was exactly the same as my family. And that's where age and just exposure to more and more and more taught me that the framework that I grew up in and the lens through which I was viewing some of these situations was very, very limited. Some of it, though, at least in my case, was a deliberate intent that I embarked on to boost my confidence. That's worked over time. However, my mom to this day if I, for instance, haven't talked to a cousin of mine, or if I have done this or that. And it's not just my mom. There's a lot of other people that are a lot older than me who will say things like, well, what will people say? What will people think? I have cousins who I haven't spoken to since high school. And one of them lives in New York. I remember when I mentioned this to my mom, she said, well, have you called her? I said, no, I haven't heard from her in 30 years. I'm not going to call her. And she said, well, but if you don't call her, then she'll always be able to say, Scott didn't call me.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I don't care. She can say it all she wants. But that goes as to a different mentality that age didn't necessarily wipe away around what other people think.
Yeah. And I also get curious as far as when it comes to the eavesdropping, the theme of the conversation. I wonder if once one's gets older or more mature, does the eavesdropping increase or decrease?
Do
Does it
you?
increase because of the curiosity that I might have? Because I experience it. I think when I was younger, I didn't really take the time to try and listen to other conversations because I had no idea why. but I think now it's become a lot more frequent just because the curiosity has increased drastically about how other people are experiencing their life on this planet.
What would you do? Let's say you were visiting New York,
Mm-hmm.
and you, of course, would hopefully hang out at my house at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say I thought that you had gone to the store to get a sandwich or something, and so my husband and I were in the house.
I'm definitely going to have to leave a camera for when this happens.
And we started talking, and it turns out you hadn't left the house. You were just in a different room, and you were on the other side of the door. And you heard one of us say, well, that Oleg. And then there'd be silence, and then you'd start to hear us talking. Would you open the door and walk through and announce your presence, or would you silently listen? What would you do?
I would silently listen, and then from
That's
there,
my homeboy.
and then from there, I would open a door and acknowledge what was said. But it's funny that you mentioned that because I feel like situations like that have happened multiple times throughout my life. And Gavin Lovejoy, one of my really good friends, has joined us here. I'm sure this has happened to him. You know, there's those situations where you're talking about someone else, nothing necessarily negative or bad, but you just acknowledge something about that person. And sometimes I have found myself that this happens in texting quite a bit, where I'll be texting one person. Let's say there are like 3 or 4 different people that I'm corresponding with at the same time. So if I'm corresponding with one about Scott Mason or whoever, well, I've had situations where I actually accidentally sent that message to that person only to realize that was the same exact person. So I think to a degree that concept of the truth always comes out, or the truth always has a way to come out, there's probably truth within that. And I don't know how it happens. I don't know if it's because the concentration and the focus is so great on that other individual. So even though I might be talking with Gavin or whoever else, the brain just literally sets like almost like an intention or an action, like an automated action that just happens.
If my husband and I were talking about you and you overheard before you opened the door and announced yourself, and we were trashing you, would you, and that won't happen, by the way, but just let's imagine.
Hope not. Yeah.
It won't.
And if it will, I'll listen. Don't worry.
I've known you too long and too well for that to happen, so don't worry about it. This is too late. The trashing phase, if it were ever to have happened, is past. In any event, we were, let's say we were talking about you. Would you say, to yourself, I don't give a shit what they think? Or would you say, maybe I need to examine something about myself?
Yeah. Well, I think it's what I think of that is if in me saying I don't fill in the blank, what one thinks is I think that will lead into unresolved anger and tension. And I've experienced this more and more with the people in my life who have shared similar situations with. And that's unless I choose to acknowledge the particular situation at hand, what ends up happening is that down the road, there's going to be tension. So in that case, if I heard you talking with David about me, and let's say it's things that I didn't fully agree with, and then afterwards, if I didn't have the space to process those between the three of us, down the road in future conversations, I will not be thinking about the conversation at hand, but rather I'll be thinking about the conversation that took place between the two. And that's where I think there's an interesting line between, okay, to what degree do you choose to acknowledge it and let it go? And then the other part of that, in my opinion, is I don't believe it's fully possible not to care. That's how I think. I think there's always a level of caring that happens. So even in the events where I say, "Oh, I don't care. Let's just move on past it." Well, the reality of the matter is I do care.
Yeah.
I just may not care to the 10th degree that you think I should care, but I still care. Information is information, and I don't think there is any form of information that doesn't influence or doesn't impact one individual. So that's where I think there's that interesting kind of dilemma between the two, and that's how do you process the information. Gavin actually had asked a very good question here that I wanted to put on the screen, and that is, what can you replace gossip with to replace the feeling of validation, image, or feeling better about yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I think there's the interesting, situation, like what role does it serve? What role does it play in conversations to begin with?
Right. And there is an actual theory about gossip, that it serves an important social function by enforcing social norms through ways that are, at least according to some, insidious or surreptitious, but it does enforce those norms.
Yeah. I also get curious as far as, why do we talk about other people to groups? Is it because it's harder for us to process the information and to make the best possible decision? Or is it relying on other person's validation in order to validate our own perception of that person? But then does that go to confidence?
Yeah.
Do I not feel confident enough in my own perception of a particular meeting or an individual? Therefore, I seek to gossip about that person with someone else in order to validate my own thoughts and feelings.
There was a recent guest on my podcast by the name of Frank Agan.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Agan wrote a book on networking. It's excellent, by the way. It's not a book that is one of these, I'm a speaker and want to have something to market and to be able to say, I wrote a book sort of things. It actually is like a legit good book.
Mm-hmm.
And he relays a story in it about how he moved into, and I might be getting some of the details wrong, but the thrust of the story was he moved into a neighborhood and he became friends with the next door neighbor. And the next door neighbor told him, oh, you should avoid so-and-so who lives up the street. He's a jerk. He's a horrible human being, or not a very nice human being, and you don't want anything to do with him. And so the author of the book says, I was frank. He says, I avoided this person. And then through a set of circumstances that happened many, many months later, he had to end up getting to know this person. And they ended up really being friends. Mm-hmm. And so the point of the story in a networking context was really be careful about letting the judgment of others influence you, because you may be depriving yourself of business or career advancement opportunities because the person that is being trashed may actually be this awesome person, and it very well could be a problem that was between the person that was talking about the individual and that individual that has nothing to do with any ways in which you would interact. Yeah. So I am, to some extent, of mind about that. And I want to weigh those things carefully. And if I hear something bad about someone, look, I know someone I have known a long time who was dating a woman for a long time, and there was talk about them getting engaged. And the woman went to a party, and there was, by coincidence, at that party, someone who knew the man that this woman was going to get engaged to, and I knew as well. And this woman who was at the party pulled aside the potential fiance of my friend
Mm-hmm.
and told her upon meeting her, don't marry or don't date, da 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 da. Don't you know everyone knows that he's crazy?
Mm-hmm.
He's not crazy. And they are married and they have multiple children together and they are a beautiful couple. If she had paid attention to this other acquaintance of ours, she might have backed away from the relationship of her life.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, and I'm saying this with all honesty, I feel horrible even uttering it out of my mouth.
Mm-hmm.
But I would be being dishonest if I weren't saying it. There have been times when people have not said something negative to me about someone, and later I've been after something bad has happened, XYZ, who I've known, has said, oh, yeah, I knew this about so-and-so that you were dealing with, but I didn't want to be trashing them. And my response was, why the hell didn't you tell me? This whole situation, man, could have been avoided. And they said exactly, well, I didn't want to bias you. I wanted you to give that person a chance. But then I ended up needlessly enduring something that I went into with my eyes completely closed.
I also wonder when it comes to those situations, because I've experienced both sides. I've experienced the side where the person had, let's say, a bad encounter with someone else, and then they didn't choose to tell me afterwards. To what degree does that situation truly repeat itself? So in that case, you didn't have the best, the other person didn't have, but the third person might have had the best experience of their life. So I think there's so many unknowns and there's so many factors. One of them is the person that you might be interacting with. They might be in a different stage of their life today than they will be 5 months down the road.
Yes.
So that's where I think the question of how do you choose to pass on the information to other people about other people, and what is that information, in knowing that it can influence the perception that one has of that person prior to them actually having an in-person meeting. So if I were to go into a conversation and tell you, Scott, I just had a conversation with X, Y, and Z, and this is what it turned out, and the outcome of it, let's say, was negative, I don't think it's possible for you to like reverse what I said,
right,
and not have a negative influence on the upcoming conversation you're going to have with the same exact person. I feel like it's impossible to not do that as a human being, especially if you respect the other person's opinion. So then you take it to heart, you take it personally, and then there's this whole other chain of events that takes place. And so that's where I wonder is, okay, what is our responsibility in passing the information about other people, and also knowing that information truly can impact the relationship or the future of one, if there is one to begin with.
Also, what are the motives that one has in telling them?
Yeah.
Because let's be honest, I don't think there is, well, I shouldn't say, I'll say this. I don't think that there is human, I won't say we. I don't think there are that many human beings that if someone has done something that they perceived wrong to them, that don't get some sort of delight in influencing another's opinion about that person. Because in a way, it's a revenge.
Yeah.
So-and-so didn't pay me back $20 that they owed. I don't want to influence your opinion, Oleg.
Yeah.
But 6 years later, they didn't pay me back $20. I'm just saying. Now, I could say that, and I could even tell myself that I'm doing it just so you get a fair warning. But some of this inside my motives could be mixed. I'm getting that person back. They're not going to get a loan from Oleg because they don't know it, but I will have talked about them behind their back. and told Oleg about that $20. And
Yeah.
Oleg, because he trusts me, his eyebrows will go up a little bit, and he'll say, "Oh, I won't hold that against them." But of course he will. How could you
Yeah.
not after hearing something like that?
I've had a situation actually like that happen before where a friend of mine did a similar thing, loaned me some money, and then due to my own complications, I wasn't able to repay back within the same exact time frame. And then it was later on, I was actually meeting a friend of a friend who had mentioned to me this, and he had said, "Hey, you didn't pay back X, Y, and Z on the time." Or I don't think he phrased it like that, but he said something along the lines of like, "When are you going to pay back X, Y, and Z?" And so that's where I think, even though I was in the wrong of not being able to pay back in the time that I had promised that I would, but at the same time, I also find that that's business that's meant to be kept between the two people. So I think spreading information like that, it for sure influenced my perspective and perception of the other person, even though he was the one that loaned money. And so that was a journey I had to go on in processing that, anger and frustration. And what I've learned ultimately is that it all boils down to communication, and having the ability to communicate. In my case, why I was late, what was happening, and all this other stuff might have prevented some of these other things that took place.
Here's a real life situation that occurred, and I'd be curious to know how you might respond to this.
Yeah.
A relative of mine, not a close relative, but a relative nevertheless, came over to my house one Thanksgiving with her new boyfriend that she wanted me and my other extended family members to meet. And I heard someone said to me when I said, "Oh, my relative's boyfriend, blah 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 blah." I grew up in a smallish town, so this sort of thing could happen. This would never happen in New York City. I might,
Yeah.
but it'd be harder to happen. I said, my relative's friend, blah blah blah, is coming. I can't wait to meet him. I'm so happy she's found someone she's been dating a while. And the person said, "Oh, you didn't know? That person was in jail for 15 years for rape."
Mm-hmm.
How would you have reacted?
I would have. That's an interesting situation to be in, because I think it's hard to be in that situation and not have any form of bias, right?
To say the least.
I
Oh, yeah. He just
No,
tried
but
to murder someone, that's all. Nothing big.
well, yeah, because then I think it's almost like an instinct. It's inevitable that you're probably gonna think of that question, and that's, are you next, or is someone in your family next, right? I think it's just
Or her.
it's or her. It's just natural to think those, and that's where I find it interesting. I was having a semi-related conversation with another friend of mine in my network who does work with people who either were incarcerated or have had similar situations like that as the one that you described. And so what he does is he tries to help them find second and third and fourth chances.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in a situation like that where this individual is in your household, and yes, you might be aware of giving people not only second, third, fourth, but however many chances they need to learn the different things. Are there certain things that you simply are not able to ration and come back from, such as the killing of another human being? And then in that case, I mean, how do you personally justify that in your mind?
Yeah.
Right? So I feel like if that was a situation that happened in my mind, it would be, or in my household, I feel like I would be able to find the common ground and common space to keep going within that and acknowledging it. But would I tell you that I didn't acknowledge the situation for what it was and brushed it off? Probably not. I think I would acknowledge the fact, or I guess you could say the facts. It is for what it is. It is that there was time that was spent, and then I also think that there are some of these other words. They're trigger words:
Yes.
prison, murder. So even if the person was wrongly convicted, still you still think about it as a human. So I think there are certain situations. I don't know if this makes sense at all, but I think there's certain situations where it's it's harder to. It's not necessarily harder to see the multiple sides to it, but it's harder to not acknowledge the situation for what it was.
Yes.
So that's where I like in your case, what did you do? I mean, how did you respond to that?
This was pre-internet days.
Yeah.
And so I had no real way to research it. I chose to hold the knowledge in my mind. I do believe I told my parents about it. Or I mentioned it to a close family member. I don't know if it was true. I could have heard this. The person who told me this I felt was reliable, but they could themselves have received bad information, or they could have
Yeah.
had an axe to grind against this person. And then part of me said, well, wait, if I'm hearing that he had been involved in such and such situation, presumably my relative who was dating him knew it as well.
Yeah.
And so she was comfortable with it. Who am I to interfere with? Who am I to overrule her judgment? To me, that would be highly patronizing. And but yeah, it's one of those things where I really don't know. Maybe this was evidence that her judgment was warped, or maybe it was all totally false. That's the other thing, is that things can get misunderstood. There have been times, and of the regrets I've had in my life, these ring the most. Or not, maybe not the most, but among the most, which is when I have heard information. And by the way, what I'm about to say always occurred due to my own lack of maturity.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just, I'll just throw that out there. Neither of us, but especially me, have ever claimed to be perfect and have never made a mistake. But there have been times where I've heard things, or people have told me things, and I've misunderstood it. And then I've said to someone I trust, oh my God, I can't believe someone told me XYZ. But I misunderstood what they were saying, or they were saying it in oblique terms. And so I was like, oh my God, this and this and this is what I've heard and what they were implying, when it really wasn't true. And then over time, with maturity, I learned to ask more detailed questions, or
Yeah.
to whatever. And then I think, well, maybe things have been missed, or maybe people said to me things that when they were drunk, where they were just babbling, and I took that as at face value, or
Mm-hmm.
people said things to protect their ego or to present a certain image that may have put someone else down, and I heard it and believed it, and then thought or passed on information, not in bad faith, but showing an error in judgment on my part. And I think that's probably happened to me as well. I'm sure there have been times, in fact, I know for a fact, there are times where people have come up to me and said, well, so-and-so told me that you did this, Scott, or so-and-so told me that you said this and this and this, Scott. And they didn't even give me the benefit of the doubt. In one case,
Yeah.
someone said, I hated you for years, Scott, because someone told me that you did blah, 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 blah. And it was something that was totally untrue. And so, but that, what other people did to me, I can always forgive them for. What
Mm-hmm.
I have a hard time sometimes is, even if it's due to the maturation process, situations in which I've done it to others. Because I know how it feels to have, and I think it's part of the human experience, having these sorts of things happen. But I always feel bad when I've hurt another person, even if it's inadvertent.
Yeah.
But that's what can happen.
Well, and it's also, at least in my opinion, I think it's difficult to always communicate in an honest fashion. And
Yes.
so what I mean by that is always telling the honest truth, because I
Yes.
think what ends up happening sometimes is honesty at least in certain situations, it's harder to practice because there are situations where I think honesty does not save but protect one's identity or whatever it
Yeah.
is. I mean, you and I have had difficult circumstances when we were younger, and so because of that, we had to practice those forms, and
Yeah.
that's choosing to be dishonest in order to actually save our own lives in some situations. So
Yeah.
I that's one of the things that I find it's a ongoing challenge, and that's choosing to be honest. So for example, if a friendship is not going the way that two parties expect it to be, or if it's not, as Nancy John coined the phrase, transformative, or if it's transactional, why is it hard, or why does it appear to be hard to just acknowledge it for what it is and say that, okay, this friendship led us here, it served us in X, Y, and Z way, but it doesn't serve us moving forward. So then instead, there's a series of stories that get created around it, and then that friendship just exists for the sake of existing. And that happens, I think, in many other situations. So I don't know where we got that point from, but that's just the beauties of the show, is going down rabbit holes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's just what it is. It's I think for me, radical honesty, it's something that I try to practice on every day. Do I get it right 100% of the time? Absolutely not.
It
Because there are
go.
situations where I don't feel I have 100% confidence to either express it on my own terms or actually be understood and accepted 100% from the other party.
There's also a bit of ethical murkiness that can go on. It's something I've gotten clarity on in the past 2 or 3 years, but before that, I did not have clarity on, and I suspect I'm not the only one. And that is the ethical imperative of treating others in a way that you would like to be treated, which I interpreted as I interpret as trying to avoid hurting people's feelings, being empathetic. How would I feel if I were this person hearing XYZ? So that to me is a legitimate ethical responsibility. That's the nature of the golden rule: treat others as you would like to be treated. So it can be easy, and for a long time it was easy for me to interpret that as being, let me not be hurtful to other people, let me not say things that will make them feel bad about themselves or that will leave them feeling the way I felt when I was hurt. I like to not have my feelings hurt,
Yeah.
so let me not hurt the feelings of others, versus
But
the
do you
ethical
also
imperative of being honest.
do you also feel like there is a line to be drawn within that, though? Because in me sitting here and thinking that what I'm going to say is going to hurt your feelings may actually prevent me from saying that thing and really getting to the root of how I feel and how you might be feeling, but yet it's either you don't have the words or the courage or the confidence or whatever, or the perspective to express what I might be feeling, and the same thing is true vice versa. So I wondered, to what degree does thinking about how other people are going to think and react and respond to what you're going to say to them, to what degree does that actually prevent us from disclosing the full truth of the situation?
Well, I think that that's where, at least on my end, I've gotten clarity. There's a great book I read a few years ago called No More Mr. Nice Guy. And one of the things that that author pointed out is that people are more resilient than we give them credit for. My obsession with not hurting people's feelings was actually patronizing them. I think my ethical imperative was warped, or at least it was too singular. I was willing to sacrifice the long term need for honest communication for the short term ethical benefit of having their feelings not hurt. But one of the things I've learned about being in a relationship for a very, very long time, and I don't credit myself with this piece of wisdom, I actually credit my husband David with that, which is that hurting other people is part of the human condition.
Yeah.
And that's why he and I, we've been together almost 23 years. Of course, there have been times where we've hurt each other. Even just last week, we've been talking. There was an incident we had where there was an argument where feelings were hurt. And we both, during the post hurt feelings conversation, acknowledged that one of the strengths of our relationship is that we understand that feelings are going to get hurt sometimes in the relationship. My avoidance of that was not acknowledging that reality and assuming that other people couldn't accept it. Sometimes people can't accept that feelings get hurt in relationships, but really part of my maturation process was realizing that that's just the way that life is. The other part of my maturation process was understanding, like I mentioned earlier, that even if people cannot accept that feelings get hurt, people do get over their feelings being hurt.
Yeah. Gavin is actually one of the people here that passed on something to me that I actually took to heart and started to implement more within my life. And that's one of the things that he had said in a conversation that him and I had however long ago. He said that if I haven't disappointed you yet, just wait. And I found that to be such a profound statement because there's a lot of truth there. People are bound to disappoint other people.
Yes.
And I've also found that if I choose to focus on things that are going to disappoint me, they come up a lot faster because that's where my attention is. Because none of us are perfect human beings. And each and every single one of us has room to improve and to grow in.
Yeah.
So finding those imperfections and looking at them as things to be disappointed about is easy to do. But it was interesting how when he brought that up, it took me a little while to process, but I think it directly relates to what you just said. And if that's a thing that is almost quote unquote inevitable about life, then in a way it's my responsibility to learn, how am I going to deal with that situation when it comes up? How am I going to process the feelings when they do come up? Because disappointments happen. I mean, I have one expectation for a friendship while you have a different expectation, and Gavin and Kenneth and everyone else. Everyone has their own set of expectations for what it means to be a friend. Yeah. So, for example, I talked to Gavin about this quite a bit. Some of us, or some people, choose to call the others on a weekly, monthly, whatever basis. But it doesn't mean that the other one is any less of a friend to them. It's just that's not something that they have on their checklist, so to speak.
Yeah.
So I've realized that over time, that in me setting an expectation for a friendship, it's actually not beneficial because my form of frequency is not someone else's form of frequency. Yeah. So when they choose to keep in touch every 3 or 4 months, well, maybe that's the thing. That's actually what their life allows. Yeah. As far as the availability of time.
Yeah. Yeah. Did I hear you say, excuse me. Wow. I hope that didn't disappoint you too much. Did I hear you say that Kenny's in the house? If so, Kenny, I just want to say hi to you. Has there ever been a time in which someone has... Actually, let me ask this a different way.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be worse if everyone were talking about you behind your back, or if no one ever talked about you at all?
That's a really good question, because that goes back to, I think, to a degree, I think that's partially tied to a form of legacy. So
what do you mean?
What I mean by that is I think it does. Everyone has, I think, a different perception of what legacy looks like. And in my opinion, I think many people seek for their work to matter and to be seen. They want to be heard. They don't want the opinions to just go to waste, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I don't know if it's necessarily one would be worse than the other, but I would say that in knowing who I am today and I think most importantly, what I'm capable of, not having other people around me discuss who I am or the work, it would be hard. It wouldn't be harder because I still think I would continue to do what I'm doing, but it would be harder to understand what is the impact that you are having on the outside world outside of yourself. And I know that you share a similar belief. I believe in this quite a bit, and that's choosing to focus on self first, and everything else kind of falls
Yes.
into its place. But I will also say that as beneficial that is, there are certain situations where having other people's perspectives and feedback is beneficial. So if I, for example, am struggling to come up with whatever concept, having conversations with other people who can help me get out of my own mind to break through whatever barriers I might be experiencing, that's helpful.
Yes,
And then
assuming
from
that person's
there,
honest. Yes.
exactly. And then from there, if that sparks some other conversations within whoever, well, maybe those are the conversations that are going to actually lead to the ultimate answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where I think there is a form of that. Now, I know that, you've studied history quite a bit, so you can look at people like Hitler. I mean, that's someone who largely depended. Maybe that was his form of legacy that he was trying to leave behind.
Yeah.
Is
And
what are
people are
people
still
going
talking
to
about him.
exactly what are people going to say about him? And I guess that's another question: is how far is one willing to go in order to achieve that ultimate form of whatever that is?
Well,
Validation, perception.
yeah, and it makes me think in some cases, maybe not his, but maybe his. Is it better to be remembered forever? Even
Yeah,
if everyone is trash talking you for the rest of history and everyone hates you and you go down as the most despised human being in basically all of history, than to be forgotten? Or is it better to be forgotten than to have your reputation tarnished and being used as a bogeyman, a rightfully pointed to bogeyman, by the way, for all of history?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I have pondered upon that question for quite some time, and that's I don't know. I was thinking about it. I don't even know how to begin in answering that, because I think part of the answer has to come with some sort of intention or approach, or even a thought of wanting one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to put myself in that situation where I were to conquer the world or have some sort of impact on the world that can be remembered. Not necessarily a positive one always,
Yeah.
because that's the other thing about history, is that it's a combination of both.
Yeah. Yeah. For every Martin Luther King, there's a Stalin.
Yeah.
Oleg, I told you some stories about things overheard about me. Have
Just
you
a few.
ever actually overheard someone say something about you?
I have. I can't say I've committed them to memory. I've
You're a better man than me. I
I
remember
will
that stuff for the rest of my life.
I will say that there are certain things that people have shared that probably stuck with me longer than they needed to. But at the same time, that's a harder one to process, because maybe there's a lesson within that. Maybe there's a lesson within some of those stories that were said about you that you're still thinking about. Maybe there's something that I have to work on as far as the tension or discomfort or whatever it may be. So there are some stories, yes, that I've heard about me that were, I guess you could say there's a grain of truth within each one of the stories and perspectives according to the person that's sharing. So I've learned over the years, for me, it's become more beneficial to not devalue or degrade the other individual for saying those things, but rather just acknowledge them for what they are, and then ask myself the question of, do I want to accept that as the truth about who I am? Or do I simply accept that as just one other opinion or one other perspective? Because here's the thing, in my opinion, and based on my experience, the more I put myself out there, the more opinions about myself that I've received.
Yeah.
So for example, when I started the whole journey of public speaking, and I started to send out all of these emails to schools, and I mean, I've been called every single name in the book. Every single name in the book that you could imagine. I've received every single response from F you to don't ever email me again to, like, almost like I know where you live type of thing. So to me at this point, I just look at those things as feedback. And what I mean by feedback is that you have to connect with X number of people in order to get to the ones that you're getting to. Because there's no other way of knowing it. There's no other way of knowing who are the right people that you are supposed to connect with besides reaching out to literally the masses, right? And it's not like people carry a name tag with them that says, I am X, Y, and Z, and I'm seeking for this particular person or whoever it is. So I think there is some degree of truth when it comes to other people's opinions and perspectives of maybe not necessarily who you are, but how you do certain things that one can learn from. But at the same time, I think there is also a huge responsibility that gets placed onto your shoulders, and that's within everything that is said about who you are, what do you choose to take in, and what do you choose to make your own reality? So if you were 5 or 10 minutes late and I were to have a conversation with whoever saying that Scott is late, and then everything that is associated with being late, disrespectful, non-professional, and all these other things.
Bobby, yeah.
Yeah. Like, do you take that in for what I choose to say, or do you acknowledge the fact that you were late because you had to go to the bathroom?
What if the things that you eavesdropped on
Yeah.
and heard about yourself were positive? For instance,
Oh, that I've
what
definitely taken that in.
well, but let's talk about this for a second. What if it were, for instance, a really beautiful woman,
Mhm.
and you heard her telling her girlfriend, there is no one I would rather date than Oleg?
Yeah.
How would you take that?
I probably would have to say absolutely, right?
Would that stick in your mind, though, the same way that something negative would?
That's a good question. Probably not, because I would choose to focus more on the positive than the negative experience. I think for me, what I've learned over time is that although there are still some negative experiences that stick in my mind, the positive ones seem to outweigh the negative ones.
Mm-hmm.
But I will also say that that wasn't always the case. I think the reason why it is the way it is now is because I'm choosing to focus more on the positive within life.
Mm-hmm.
So literally turning every single possible situation into a positive moment. So choosing to be more grateful, choosing to be more appreciative of life and surroundings. Earlier today, one of the things I was doing was I was paddleboarding here in Austin, and I met this guy on the river who, it was just a really fascinating story and the different things that he was doing. And one of the things that he had mentioned to me is that when he started to look at life through that lens, and that's truly being appreciative of everything that's surrounding him, water, insects, trees, air that he can breathe, his perception of everything changed, and his memories of what he chose to remember changed. And I found the same exact thing. Now, Gavin brought up an example here, and that's, Cleveland Browns winning the Super Bowl. That would not be a positive experience for me necessarily. So I'm a huge Detroit Lions fan, so that would not be a thing that I would try and forget that as fast as possible.
Would that rise to the level of trauma?
Yes, if they won the Super Bowl, it would rise to the level of trauma. I would have to think that it would, because it would just, yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll discuss that on another episode.
But it is interesting though to explore things like that, and also look at. I even think about sports. Think about the impact that a sporting event has on you and on your memory. A team wins, that affects you in one way compared to when a team loses. And depending on how much you have invested into that team and how much part of a team you feel, it hits you differently.
Do
And
you feel invested in the team?
I feel invested. Yeah, I feel invested in the team. I mean, I can't say that I'm the quarterback or the kicker by any means. I'm not a positional player, but
Well, that's not what I heard.
but I do feel invested in being a part of a team. I do feel invested in being part of a culture, part of an energy, part of a community. I think that's the thing that I feel invested in, is this community, like tribe-like culture, where now I'm part and I'm rooting for same objective essentially. And so when that objective is not met, then it turns into a negative experience, negative
How
memory.
would you feel if you walked into a room, but before you fully entered the room, you heard Kenny and me whispering about how you were a Cleveland Browns fan?
Well, first things first is I would have to correct the two of you, and then say
But
that
what if
that's
we were
not.
saying it maliciously? Don't associate with him. Just so you know, Kenny, he's a Cleveland
Yeah,
Brown. Okay.
and that happens, and see, that's the thing that it's funny that you bring that up, because that actually happens in the world of sports. Is that eavesdropping is used as a way to understand what one's interests are and points of alignment. And then from there's a series of decisions that many people who get involved in sports make. So if I'm not a New York Knicks fan, or if I don't like the New York Knicks, then people like Paul might view me differently. And especially if I was talking about them. So that's the thing about sports that's also interesting, is that so much of it does depend on eavesdropping into other conversations, and understanding people's interests and alignments, and then from there determining whether or not you can be part of the same community or tribe.
Do you think there's any legitimacy to doing that?
Probably not. I think it's, if anything, it's wanting. I don't know what it's wanting, to be honest with you. I think it's probably wanting a greater number to be rooting for one against the other. I think it's maybe thinking that if there are more people that choose to cheer for one team, then the chances of that team winning are that much higher, which I feel like they're really not, because the players still have to play the game. And so I don't know. But then at the same time, it's like you question, it's like, okay, if you do believe in the force of the universe and whatever, and I mean, think about the things you've been able to accomplish in your life, right? It started with a thought, and then it probably followed by like a uncontrollable desire to achieve that thing. And next thing you know is that you've actually manifested that into a final product. So what gets me curious about sports is that, can the same thing be true? If I have a thought of a team winning and I choose to do everything that I can within my fingertips, cheer them on, get more people to cheer them on, have people switch teams, so like continue to grow that energy, does that influence the outcome?
To me, that reminds me of the question that is always raised by prayers before sports events. Well, where I grew up, that was, I don't remember if they did that or not. I know it's technically illegal in a public school setting, but I know of schools, and they may have been private schools. So
Yeah.
I don't want to cast any aspersions on anybody. But there would be situations in which people would pray for their team to win a particular basketball, football, whatever game. And the question always arose, well, But if the other team is having their fans pray, how does God make a decision about who will win?
Yeah.
And
And do they offset? Do the
totally.
prayers offset each
What
other?
if they're equal? What does the universe do then? Just leave it up to who actually has the ability? I mean, but what you are talking about is affiliational identity with regards to the team. And
Yeah.
you mentioned it earlier, culture and community, and people self-identifying as part of the tribe by association with a particular team. It reminds me on a much smaller scale of a story you've heard me share before. I don't believe I've shared it on this show, though. And it's silly and ridiculous, but it goes us to the same point. Before I met David, I was on the dating market trying to meet people that were good enough for me. And I got set up with someone that was so good looking, I could barely believe my luck. And the conversation was going well. Then he said he wanted to see this play, Sunset Boulevard. And I said, and he said, would you go see it with me? I said, I saw it. And actually, I would love to see it with you, but I despise musicals. I hate them so much. And I saw that because my mother was in town and it was boring. It was all I could do to keep my eyes open. I was dying for it to end from the second the curtain went up. And he said, well, but Elaine Page is going to be in there. And I said, well, I know who Elaine Page is. She means nothing to me. I don't care. I don't want to see it. But I'll happily go out on a date with you again. So then at that point, he began to be disinterested and look around. And then, we had a little bit of a chit chat. And at first I thought, okay, I rejected his offer to take me out to see this Broadway show. And so I asked the friend who set us up, I said, I feel really bad about that because I did think he was okay. I just didn't want to see this show.
Right.
I didn't. And he said, oh, no, he wasn't upset about the fact that you didn't want to see the show. He was upset because you weren't a fan of Elaine Page. And he said, I would never date anyone that wasn't a fan of Elaine Page. Oleg, seriously, I had never heard of Elaine Page in my life. In 3/4, do you know who Elaine Page is?
No.
Yeah. Well, he ain't dating you either. And it took me a lot. I had to go and ask people, who is this Elaine Page person? And finally, I guess she was like I won't say anything negative about her. She was a Broadway singer. So in any event, I immediately dismissed that person as someone who was so ridiculous that they would not date someone just because they weren't an Elaine Page fan. That it didn't even bother me that I was rejected. I was being rejected by the absurd. But sort of thinking about what you were saying, maybe there's a different lens that I could be viewing that as. Maybe I was self-selecting myself out of a tribe. Maybe for him, Elaine Page was a surrogacy for membership in a tribe of Broadway musical theater fans. For instance, if I was a real Broadway musical theater fan, of course I would have known who Elaine Page was. I had no idea who she was, so I was not part of that tribe. And my you-know-what got booted.
Well, think about it this way, too. When it comes to at least relationships, the ones that I've been in, what many of them boil down to as far as the quote-unquote selection process is what interests you and do our interests align? So, for example, if you're not into anything personal development related, but the other person is, that might be a deal breaker. In fact, I have heard that from many people to be a deal breaker when it comes to seeking for a significant other. So there's certain things that I think people identify with, whether it's sports related. So, Casey Berman's case, it's Golden State Warriors fan, and I can't imagine his wife not being a Golden State Warriors fan, right? Or at least having enough of being able to like this sport or know a single thing about it, or not know anything, so that there's no point of disagreement. But in my case, I've realized similar things. So if I'm looking for an individual who shares similar things, such as an interest in further developing themselves, their ideas, perspectives, grown outside of beyond their boundaries and things like that. So I think it's probably natural to have those things. The question is, are there situations where you feel like the expectation is truly too high for any individual to be able to meet or to achieve? So if my expectation is to meet X, Y, and Z who has done all these different things, well, what happens if that person doesn't actually exist? What if that person only exists in your fantasy? Then it feels like, okay, I'm downgrading. Now I'm taking a step back and I have to meet this person where they're at. Or I don't know. That's the part that I've kind of been confused on, is like, is it, to what degree do you set expectations for other people while also knowing that there's certain expectations that you might not meet for someone else?
If I told you that in order to stay a friend of mine
Yeah.
and a co-host on this show, you had to be a Rihanna fan, what would you think of me?
The show would
And if
end.
you overheard me talking about you, saying, and Oleg isn't even a Rihanna fan.
The show would end right now.
Okay, click.
No, I don't know. I think it would be an unrealistic expectation, and I would tell it to you, because if it's someone that I'm not a fan of or have no desire to be a fan of, but in order for me to be a part of something, it requires me to kind of pay my dues. I don't think I would be okay with that. But that goes back to, do I have the courage and the confidence to communicate that, and do I feel safe to communicate that in a way that possibly still maintains the idea of being a part of a show or whatever other project. And that goes, I think, to probably an element of trust that it has to be within the party. The trust in the individual, that what I'm going to say and how I'm going to respond to that is going to be received. Now, how it's received, I can't really control, but I think the fact, knowing that at least it could be accepted as a possible answer, that matters.
Going back to something we were talking about earlier that piqued my curiosity. You said that when you do talk about someone else, and I've seen this, well, I'll suffice it to say, I think this is an amazing quality, and I've engaged in this myself. I've been careful with what I say, because, and you indicated you might say something like, I don't want to influence you. I want you to have your own opinion, but this is something that has occurred.
Yeah.
When we, the dreaded we, everyone on the entire planet, when we say that, do those of us who say it secretly want to influence, even though we're denying, even though it's being denied in the moment?
So for me, I think it's the opposite. For me, I think it's the opposite, because I understand that what I do say does influence it in one way. And the same thing is true of you. The same thing is true of anyone. What you say to another person influences them in some shape or form. So in buffering that conversation by saying what I'm going to say may influence the relationship that you have with that person, or the conversation that you are bound to have with them in the coming days, I think it gives something for you to consider. But then, see, the other part about that particular phrase is the phrase alone is an influence. So me telling you that what I'm about to say may influence how you see the other person. What do you choose to do afterwards? That's the bigger question. And how do you choose to take my information?
And I think that goes as to something that can get lost in conversations about eavesdropping, or when people talk about each other behind their back, which happens, is that we have the power. That's a core tenet of self-development, and it's one that I think is almost universally true, unless there's a developmental disability or some just undeniable factual situation, or unless a child is involved. We all have the ability to interpret what we hear.
Yeah.
And to uncloud the lens through which we're hearing it, or to keep it clouded, or to decide whether it's clouded or not in the first place.
Yeah. Well, let's break it down this way. So without using anyone's name or anything like that, but let's break down the situation that you and I had in as little or as much as detail as we choose.
Okay.
I told you the phrase that what I'm about to tell you is going to may influence how you engage, may influence your relationship with them. You had a conversation with that individual in the following hours.
Yep.
Did you feel that you were in that conversation looking for the negatives more than the positives because of the way that I framed that conversation to you and shared my experience with you?
I went into the conversation in an independent fact-finding mode.
Okay.
I heard what you said. It did, and I take it very seriously. And we have not been secret about the fact that our friendship is based on is a very significant one, and I think anyone hearing either of us say that would then rightfully, at least as far as I'm concerned, conclude that there is a huge amount of mutual trust and respect.
Right.
So I'm going to take very seriously what you say, and the fact that but that includes statements like, this is going to influence you. I want you to be careful when listening to this. I'm going to take that seriously too. Yeah. I also have been in situations where bosses I've worked for, one in particular that I can think of, but it's been more than one, would hear something and about a conflict between employees or between a staff member and a member of the public or something like that. And they would get very angry. You need to go talk to so-and-so and write them up and this, that, and the other. And there were times when I knew the staff member where the accusation had been lobbed against, where the accusation had been sort of lobbed against them. And I was very skeptical of this accusation against this staff member because it just didn't match anything that I knew about having worked with them day after day after day. So I would always say, let me check out the facts first. And then I would go and talk to both sides and make my own credibility judgment. And usually there were two sides, or if there were two conflicting sides, but the staff member had been someone that was generally reputable, reliable, who I just believed, I would then go back to my boss and say, I'm not going to do anything about this staff member. Maybe I'll talk to them about being careful when they have conversations in the future, something like minor, but I'm not going to get them in trouble or write them up just because you heard something from someone else, especially if I wasn't there. And so I say all of that to say, hearing what you said, I walked into this conversation in a fact-finding mode. I knew this person. I knew that this person wasn't evil or crazy or anything like that, and had a conversation so I could hear their side. Yeah. And it turned out that their version of events and your version of events comported. And that actually the feeling states that were involved and all parties were very similar. Yeah. So I'm glad I did that, because if this person reported something completely different, I would have needed to assess that. Yeah. But it also showed the value of doing that, because I was able to independently, it bolstered your credibility by me walking in there and having that conversation, hearing the exact same sequence of events, the exact same feeling states, the exact same desired outcome, really, that you and I had talked about and that they wanted as well. So I think that goes as to, there was influence that was there. It was influence that I mitigated through a fact-finding incident. Yeah. If Now, there have been situations where I've heard two conflicting stories by people, and my tendency, just to put it out there, is to believe people.
Right.
And inner relationships with the assumption of trust and the assumption of credibility. There have been situations, this happened at the business I owned prior to the one I own now, where conflicting stories came up from two staff members. They simply could not have been true. And I remember pulling them both in my office separately and saying, one of you is lying. Both of these stories cannot be true.
Yeah.
You better hope it's not you. Because if I find out it's you, then our relationship might terminate, but at best it won't be very good for you going forward. And I independently investigated once I heard these two conflicting stories. Based on the trail that I was able to find, one person I knew had to be lying.
Yeah.
Well, there were two. One person I'd worked with for a long time and always admitted his mistakes and always took the blame for everything, even if it wasn't his fault. And so when he actually was insisting that it was not his fault, my tendency was to believe him because he built up so much credibility by always taking responsibility for things. But it turns out also that the facts did not support the trail of events based on the evidence that I had, did not add up in a way that basically one of the stories of the person that I would have suspected was lying anyway, he had to have been lying. It just had to have been, or else the whole physical nature of the universe, as I know it, is fundamentally different than what I've known it to be my entire life. And in that case, then the statement that the truth teller told me actually was bolstered even more, and his influence over me grew because the one time he did say, someone's lying to you, Scott, it was right.
Yeah.
That person was. Where does that leave us? Where does it leave you hearing that?
Yeah. That's a tricky one. It's a tricky one because I'm just thinking about my own situations and similar scenarios. That what makes it tricky is the fact that I had built a set of assumptions on my end, and then all of a sudden it let's say turned out differently. So I thought that it was this person that was not telling the truth, but maybe it happened the other way. So I think that goes back to challenging assumptions and expectations and understanding that I make the joke of the New York Times bestseller that I'm writing in my head. It's a thing. Like it happens. It happens quite often. Whether it's other people's encounters, eavesdropping is a perfect example of it, right? You walk by, you hear something, and then from there, that one thought or that one word can lead to a sentence, a paragraph, a page, and next thing you know is you have a full-blown book about something that didn't actually take place the way that it did.
Yeah.
So that's where I don't know if it's possible to escape it. I think if anything, what is possible, at least from my perspective and knowing what I know now, is even in situations where I do have that full-blown book about a story that may or may not be true, I could just leave it unpublished. Not everything has to be published through the spoken or the written word. So there are certain books, as I'm sure you've experienced and everyone else that's tuning in, that can just be on the bookshelf in your mind. They don't have to be sold and passed on from one person to another and built upon for other ideas. But what's the ultimate thing behind that? I have no idea. Awareness, understanding that thoughts can just be thoughts. Not every thought is true. I remember the first time I heard that, I was kind of taken back and slightly blown away by the fact that there is truth there. Not every thought is true. It's only true because you believe it to be true.
Well, it's also related to something we've discussed on this show a lot, which is we don't always have to have an opinion about everything.
Yeah.
We don't always have to say something about everything. And that's something over time I've learned. That's, again, been part of my own maturation process.
Yeah.
A, I don't always have to have an opinion, which, of course, if I have no opinion, then there's nothing to say. But B, even if I do have an opinion, sometimes it's okay to keep my mouth shut. Sometimes it's okay to write that nasty email out and then press delete. Sometimes it's okay to text what I wanted to say and then turn around to David, my husband, and say, David, should I send this? And have him
Yeah.
say no.
Yeah.
Or to sit and say to myself, I don't need to say that. Or to walk away and say, maybe I should take a little bit of time before I open my mouth. Or I hear something that's so exciting that I feel like I need to share it with someone. Maybe, and again, I've learned this the hard way.
Yeah.
Maybe I should sleep on it overnight and decide whether anyone else really does need to hear that. Sometimes they don't need to. Or maybe I just tell my husband and no one else. Right? But that's one of the beauties, by the way, of having a husband, is there are certain things that where we say to each other, where we understand after we've been together a while, it's just mental floss or verbal vomit that's coming out. And we don't even really pay attention to it. It just means nothing, or it's venting in that moment, and we sort of know when that's happening, and we don't judge. So I get it out, so it's not out in the world. But we have that understanding in our relationship too, that sometimes we are sort of venting about something that's frustrating to get it out of our system, and I don't judge about someone else based on what I hear him say all the time, because I know he's going to just say whatever is going through his mind some days. That's part of us, and I do the same with him.
Yeah, that's part of being human. I think the other thing that you mentioned that something that I'm practicing more so now than ever before, and it truly is a challenge. Another friend of mine had inspired this idea within me, and that's choosing to sleep on it.
Yes.
Man, that's a hard one. I don't know if it's a hard one for you. That's a hard one for me.
Yeah.
Certain situations where I know I can respond in the moment and I know I can tell it as it is, but at the same time choosing to sleep on it and then waking up with literally somehow a whole new perspective truly helps, because it does. There's something incredible about sleep. It's that it can transform conflict into a perfectly reasonable conversation. I know for me, one of the phrases, and I would be curious to hear how you approach this, but this concept of why do I have to be the bigger man in a situation? I struggled with that for years. I struggled with that. In fact, whenever a situation would come up, I remember being in that moment and just asking myself, well, why do I have to be the bigger man here? This person is in the wrong. And then what I've realized over time is that the answer to that question was truly as simple as I understand it today. And that's the reason why I have to be the bigger man is because I can. Like, it really is as simple as that. And that to me was just crazy.
I appreciate
can it really be that simple? And it really is. It's like the reason why you have to be the bigger man is because you can.
I've framed that one a little bit differently. It's interesting. So of all of these sort of questions that I've struggled with, that's one that has not necessarily been at my forefront. My initial reaction, I actually rarely think that. But perhaps it's because my preemptive response to that question, what I think of before it even comes up, is that I am the bigger man.
Yeah.
So in a way, it never.
That's interesting.
Why do I have to be the bigger man? Because I'm assuming that I am. Now, maybe that's patronizing to the people that aren't the bigger man, because I'm somehow thinking of them as less. But I do think that.
So do you always take the high road then? Like, do you always take on the responsibility, even when it's not your responsibility that's meant to be taken?
I will say when I'm aware that the choice is in front of me. I'm not going to say there aren't moments when I've taken the low road, and I certainly don't want to say I've always been the higher man. It's been a continual process, as we've said earlier in the show and in other episodes. And I will say openly, I've been a jerk And so many times in my life, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
I shock myself with that. But when I'm aware that there is a choice between being the bigger man and being the lesser man, I don't really. I always say, well, I am the bigger man. A common example of that is at the gym. People lift weights, and then they leave either the weights on the machine after they're done, or
That's me.
they rack them. Yeah, or they'll rack them in some crazy order. So you have to get a 5-pound weight, you've got to pull off 245 and a
That's
25
me.
minute there. Oh my God! Oh, stop it! Please, for the love of God, stop it!
I'm in a rush. I gotta go.
And that's one of those things where I just do it anyway. I will re-rack the weights, and I will always take it off the machine, even though no one else does. Why? Because I'm the bigger man. That's just an example. I habitually do that. Or I will stand up for a pregnant woman or an elderly person in the subway because I'm the bigger man. Well, the pregnant woman I've stopped because one time I stood up for a woman that I thought was pregnant and she wasn't. Her friend made a joke about her weight because of that, and I felt terrible. But generally, if I'm sure she's pregnant,
Yeah.
and if they are disabled as well, because I'm the bigger man, even if no one else does.
Where did you learn that from? Like, who influenced that thought? Do you know?
That's a good question. I don't know where that came from. I don't know. That's a good question. But at some point, I did decide I was.
Yeah. Because that's not a common, I mean,
Yeah.
both of our situations, as well as I'm sure thousands of others, that's not a common approach.
Yeah.
I think the common approach is to probably, at least I can only speak from my perspective, what I believe to be a common approach. The common approach is to approach it with that question. Why do I have to be?
Right. Maybe some of it is influenced by the fact that I've experienced a lot of unfairness in my life because of things like my sexual orientation or things like that. Yeah. So the fact that life is unfair has never particularly fazed me. Yeah, it's unfair. So what's new? And it's unfair to my disadvantage. Well, yeah. And the sun rises in the east. You know? Okay. Tell me something I needed to know.
Do you believe that life is unfair? And what actually
totally.
let me ask you that. How do you understand that?
That's a really deep question. I don't know whether it's unfair.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes to some of the larger discussions we've had about providence, destiny. I don't know. I will say on a superficial level and on an individual level, yes, I do pretty definitively feel that it's unfair. People that were born into slavery, for instance, in the American South in the 17 and 1800s, grotesque unfairness. How can anyone say that was fair? Mm-hmm. Or people that are born in lower castes in various societies and they don't have a chance to get medical care, or they live in slums and have no opportunity to rise, or they may have developmental disabilities because they don't get adequate nutrition when they're young. How can anyone say that that's on an individual level fair? What I don't know, and I really do feel this is a more existential question, is on a larger level. To what extent is that unfair? Yeah. Is it in the course of history unfair? And also, is it unfair in terms of the scope of our lives, considering especially compared to the scope of the universe itself, or even our spirits, if one believes in spirit and spiritual things.
Yeah.
Right. There is the argument, is it unfair that Timmy gets a bigger toy in the sandbox than Tina? Yes. maybe it is, but it's such a microscopic unfairness. But they don't realize that it's unfair until they leave, until they're grown up, and they look back and say, "I can't believe I'm mad that the toy car that Tony got to play with was 3 inches bigger than the one Steve got."
Yeah.
No one. And so once we leave this earth, if we believe there's anything afterwards, are these things that we're seeing as grotesque unfairnesses anything at all? I don't know. Not that we should strive to be content with the unfairness.
Yeah. For me, I think it's a difficult question to answer because I think it's much more than just a black or white approach, yes or no. Because it's at the same. You made a lot of great points within that. To what degree does your or what something that perceives to be unfair is just something that's actually playing in your favor? So being born into a certain set of circumstances. Now, once again, I'm not saying that one is right or wrong. It's just they are what they are. But the only way that I could relate this to what you were describing is to look back at the circumstances that we were born into.
Yeah.
Do you look at that as unfair, or do you look at that as literally the best thing that could have ever happened because that's the thing that guided you in finding who you are today? Your purpose, your essence, your meaning.
And that's a powerful point. That is part of the complexity.
And if that is one of the things that you look for at the end of the day is a sense of purpose, then what greater fairness could that experience have provided you with?
Well, and I do feel that sometimes the unfairnesses that I experienced were secret blessings. That one could flip it and say that the lack of unfairness that other people received actually was unfair to them. And I have a friend who we have a mutual jealousy society. I'm jealous because success in traditional means comes so easily to him. And he's mega successful. And he's lived a life that has had, from a professional perspective, comfort and opportunity and stability in a way that is beyond my ability to imagine.
Yeah.
Yet he views, and I will say there are times in my moments that I have where I'm jealous and I wish that were me. I wish I was someone that could fit my square self into a round hole more easily. But he always says, "Scott, you are always accomplishing things that I can't, or I haven't. And you've had this adventurous, exciting life, and you've done all of these things." And so from his perspective, it might be unfair that for whatever reason he hasn't had. Here's an example.
Yeah.
Another person I know like that, good looking male, smart, well-spoken, great personality, has had jobs handed to him. And I mean good jobs that anyone would be envious of.
Yeah.
C-suite positions, making lots of money. He was sort of looking for another job at one point. So I suggested that he apply to an organization that I used to work at that had a job opening. And he did that interview. And I heard, they told me, "Scott, what on earth were you thinking? Why did you refer this person to us?" And I realized he'd never had to sell himself. So he didn't know how to just walk into that. He was so used to things just coming to him that he just walked in there assuming that the interview was pro forma and that he would just get the job. And this company was not taking that approach. And in fact, they said, "Scott, we would have wanted someone who interviewed like you did when you interviewed for your job with us." Well, I wanted that job. I wanted it. And I had to go through situations where I had to prove myself over and over so much that, yeah, I knew how to go in there and sell myself. And I did. And I never took for granted that I would get that or any job. And so I prepped, and I had my call to action. I had my differentiate. I had the answer to every single question. I practiced. So I was all as wonderful and fun as I could be. And it worked. And so again, what you're talking about occurred. The disadvantages that I had really were huge advantages. I knew how to sell, and I still know how to sell.
Yeah.
He doesn't.
Maybe he eavesdropped too much. Maybe he eavesdropped into the other conversations that said that he can get any job in the world just by showing up.
Can you forgive someone that eavesdrops on you? Oleg?
I'd like to think so. Yeah. Does it apply to every situation? I don't know. I'm sure there's certain situations that it's probably a lot harder to forgive. And I think one of the things that makes it harder to forgive is that it's harder to I think it's possible to forgive. I don't think it's possible to forget. And I think the fact that it's harder to forget, it makes it that much harder to forgive. That's how I understand it. I think there's a relationship between the two. So if it's a situation that's harder, it's going to be more challenging for me to forget. That's going to be quite the journey that I'm going to have to go on to actually forgive that individual.
Is there a place online where people can regularly eavesdrop into Mr. Lovely?
Yes, there is. There's one place called Overcoming the Odds that people can eavesdrop into different conversations that talk about ways to reframe one's story, reframe one's circumstances, and find the strengths, the abilities, the uniqueness of their own story, their own identity. Outside of that, I would say the only other place I could think of is called The Power of Your Story, which is a similar space to Overcoming Odds, and that's conversations about reframing, recreating that narrative, ultimately finding the version that one is looking for. Now, I know that there are places within your life that people can eavesdrop, and I know that there are more than Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn.
In particular, you can eavesdrop on me at purposehighway.com, which is the podcast that I host that tells the stories of entrepreneurs, influencers, and thinkers who have connected to their higher purpose to build a better self and a better world.
Now, would you say that people would be able to eavesdrop more easily if they heard about the show more? Would you say that's
I
a
believe
fair
that they would. And so if they went to our Facebook page and left a review, or to our LinkedIn page and left a review, then I think that the magical providential powers that govern those platforms' algorithms would push them out to people, and we would have even more amazing engagement than we have had already. And we got good engagement tonight. Thank you, Gavin, Kenny, everyone, Paul, everyone else who was here, for what you had to contribute. If you could make sure you leave us those reviews on Facebook, on the Facebook page, or on our LinkedIn page, we'd be so incredibly grateful.
Yeah. Now, I want to say the same thing. Thank you to all the people for eavesdropping with their insights and perspectives. That's the thing that I think we pride ourselves on, is that this space, it might start with the two of us or a special guest, but at the same time, it's about the comments and the engagement that people bring in and their own insights, because at the end of the day, you and I only know what we know, and there's much more in this world that we don't know. And so the only way to find that out is through other people's perspectives.
Absolutely. I'm blown away by the things I've learned from people participating in these conversations, and I cannot wait to learn more from them.
Mm-hmm.